history goes on and things change, but it's hard to forget some of the things that you're involved in, and then by the same token, collectively, it's so easy to forget. Now, moving on, there's another fellow who was really special to me. We got the newspaper in the afternoon in the mail, and every time that the mail ran, I'd go get the newspaper because I kept up with baseball. I kept up with minor league and major league. I was Atlanta, at that time, Milwaukee Braves fan, but I also liked the Cardinals because my friend Uncle Oliver, as I called him, he liked the Cardinals, so I'd go listen to them when they were playing the Braves, as I mentioned earlier. But one of my heroes that I followed with the box scores was of the Albany Cardinals, and his name was Warren Roddenberry. And he was their ace pitcher, and I always paid particular attention when he was pitching. And then he left Albany and was promoted to a couple of other leagues up. And that's the end of that, except for when I was in Carrabelle coaching, I was down at Gulf Station and I heard some men talking about Warren Roddenberry. And, well, they were calling him Roddenberry. He was a state trooper. And I stopped and listened to him a little bit, and I said, by any chance, was that Warren? Yeah, that's his first name. We call him Rod, but he's Warren Roddenberry. I said, I wonder if that's the same one. Well, when I met him, he is absolutely the same person. And he shared with me his scrapbook, he and Linda, his wife, and we have a lot of common friends in Monticello. And Warren's from a little place called Metcalf up near Thomasville. And here is another connection. I remember my mother and I would go to Thomasville on occasion to shop or do something. And generally when we were up there, we would eat at a little cafe on the street there the cafe was the Plaza. And I remember going in there, and they had pictures of the Thomasville Dodger minor league ball players all around the walls. And I admired that and looked at every one of them and thought about if they were going to make the majors or not. Well, skip forward 40 years and talking to Warren, he said, I signed my first contract in the Plaza Cafe. No, you didn't. Yeah, I did. And he went on to tell me about how that came about. So, I don't know. I love the connections of things like this, and there are more. But this makes this place special to me because it just connects my roots. Also, I don't have any pictures of this, but the railroad from Carrabelle. Two of the men that worked with the train was Mr. Ketchum and Mr. Pitts. At Ebenezer Baptist Church when I went there, both of those men were in that church and their families. And Mr. Ketchum's daughter was Elizabeth MacDonald, who was a good friend. She could play the fire out of the piano. And my daddy loved to sing, so they hit it off. But years later, when I was in Carrabelle, the Methodist Church had a reunion. And the preacher of that reunion, who had previously was a preacher here, when they drove up, his wife came walking over to my house, and I was outside, so I met her, and it was Elizabeth Ketchum, who was MacDonald in her, and then she had married someone else who was a preacher. And then later on, as I talked to people in Carrabelle, particularly Miss Gladys Murray, who lived in the Ketchum house at the time, told me about Elizabeth and her sister and how well they could sing and all the things. So, I don't know, there's just a connection there that I treasure. Moving on, in World War II, the NORAD air defense system began to take shape due to the threats and attacks in our homeland. Here are some significant NORAD key events. President Franklin Roosevelt, Prime Minister King issued a declaration that voiced the concept of U.S.-Canadian joint defense, sanctioned and established of the Permanent Joint Board of Defense to conduct necessary analysis and consultations, and this would be known as the Ogdenburg Declaration, and this was in August of 1940. In 1945, in December, the Alaskan Air Command, AAC, was activated. In March of 1946, the Army Air Force's Air Defense Command constituted at Mitchell Field in New York. The command was activated in March of 27, 1946, with two bases, Mitchell Field and Hamilton Field, California. The United States Air Forces activated the Air Defense Command at Mitchell Field, New York in March of 1946. In August of 1949, the Russians exploded an atomic device. On the 1st of September 1949, the Eastern and Western Air Defense Forces were activated by ADC. September 49. President Truman publicly announced that in August the Russians had exploded an atomic device. In December of 1949, the Army Chief of Staff informed JCS that he considered creation of a unified command for the defense of the United States an urgent requirement, and he recommended its rapid establishment. In February of 1950, headquarters of the United States Air Forces directed the Continental Air Command to establish a civil air raid warning system. In July of 1952, beginning with the U.S. Ground Observers Corps Operation Skywatch, during which civilian air defense observer posts were manned round the clock, the Air Defense Command begins a 24-hour Ground Observer Corps operations. That was interesting to me because I worked with my mother, who we both had volunteered. They had established an observation, a GOC Ground Observers Corps station in Caps in Tungsten Plantation, and they were seeking volunteers to help staff it round the clock. And my mother volunteered, and I talked them into letting me be a member also, even though I guess I was maybe 12, but they didn't say anything about my age and didn't record anything about my age. I don't think anybody knew how young I was until they had a medal ceremony over in Jacksonville at, guess it was Mayport, and those of us who had qualified for some medals were taken over there, and in a big Air Force ceremony, we, just like all the other Air Force people who got awards, we were called up on the stage and given our duly earned medals, I suppose. Anyway, just seems almost like a dream now, look back at that. And believe me, we knew about the threat of the Soviet Union, but I never considered it being as important as it was, what we were actually doing. You'll find out more about that later if you don't already know. Caps, or Tungsten, was the last station for the Ground Observers Corps to the west and the south. I guess they had radar systems that covered most of the Gulf to the western part and on out. And I don't know that that's the reason, but I know it was known that ours was the last watch site in the network that went around Florida and up the East Coast. In September of 1952, Cape Canaveral, Florida was the scene of the Beaumark, the only surface-to-air missile ever deployed by the United States Air Force. It was a test launch. In September of 52, the 25th of September, 2 weeks later, a Navy picket ship placed an around-the-clock duty for the first time off the East Coast. And in April of 1953, the Soviet Union exploded a thermonuclear device. In 1959, the U.S. Ground Observers Corps units were inactivated. So our posted caps or tungsten was from about 52 through 59. 59 actually was when St. Joe Paper Company bought the tung oil plant and the mill and the plantation. In February of 59, the Royal Canadian Air Force assumed responsibilities for manning the operation positions at DEW line stations in Canada. And we can read the rest of that, but one of the things I did want to mention was, we'll get into it in a little bit, but the Cold War was an unusual time where we just didn't know what to expect and knew it wouldn't be anything good from the Soviet Union. And every day it was something. People were building fallout shelters and just worrying to death and all kind of things. And this was an effort that involved a lot of citizens in the actual defense of the United States, filling in for areas that did not have adequate radar coverage.
Hello, my name is Joe Kalia. I have begun researching and writing, and as a result, I have been able to write a couple of books and some magazine articles, and been very fortunate that the New York Archives has seen fit to publish a couple of them. The most recent one is one titled The Ground Observer Corps 2.0, and what it deals with is the organization that was set up during World War II and then in the early 1950s to watch the skies of the United States. It was called Operation Skywatch, and the point of it was that our radar systems in the 40s were not adequate, and in the 50s were not quite up to standard yet either. So they employed thousands, about 800,000 actually, of volunteer citizens to man various observation posts and watch for airplanes. And when they saw the planes, they would report them to what was called a filter center, and then that center would try to make contact. If they couldn't, then they would send up fighter planes to see who it was, friend or foe. The reason for all this, of course, was the fact that the Russians had now come onto the stage as a aggressive opponent of the United States, and there was a real fear that they might try to attack us with intercontinental bombers. So it was a very serious business, and old as I am, I was very fortunate as a young child to accompany my grandfather on some of his tours of duty at the local observatory, which was built in the park in Ilion. And it wasn't until later years that I realized how important this whole thing was. But at the time, it was an adventure, and I had some understanding that, what we're doing is important. So the Ground Observer Corps was something that's kind of always stuck in my mind. So it's been a lot of fun, and I enjoy research and writing, and being supported indirectly by the New York State Archives has given it all the more meaning.
You can see the Ground Observer Corps of 1952, and Skywatch was in the northern part of the United States, in the West Coast, and then the southern part and the central part was kind of on standby in the beginning of it in 1952. Ground Observer Corps is a sign that was promoting people signing up and volunteering. And in caps, in my days in Jefferson County, along with my mother, I served with the Ground Observer Corps, and I'm sure some other members of my family did also, and in the community, because we had that, or they had that place staffed around the clock, 24 hours a day. And you see how large it was, a little old box building that was kind of like a guard building at the entrance to Tung Oil Plantation. to the mill and business side of it. Never knew of it being used for anything other than what we did, which was Ground Observer Corps. And we went through training and had manuals that showed us different kinds of planes and how to identify them, and we were to be looking and get information about which direction and what kind and about what speed, and I'm sure it was all guesses, but with some basis anyway. What I do remember was they had a telephone that we had to place our calls in after we logged, or at the same time we were logging the information, and I still remember picking up the phone, and the first thing I said was, "Aircraft flash, aircraft flash." I had to say it twice, and then they would respond with asking for the information we had. And as the fellow described earlier there, if they didn't know what the plane was or couldn't find out, they would send an airplane up to find out if it was the enemy. So that was an interesting approach. And that looks like a 1958 Chevrolet maybe that's coming by. We had one, but I don't believe that was our family's. Here's a poster. And I remember when we broke in, I mean, we had permission, kind of. They knew what we were doing. When us boys went to the bowling alley that was part of the company store, it had been there in the 40s and in the 50s, early 50s. And this particular poster or sign was on the walls of the bowling alley. "Join us in Skywatch, the Ground Observers Corps." This is an early poster before the GOC became part of the U.S. Air Force, which, by the way, it was when I was involved in it. It was a literal part of the Air Force, and our meetings about 2 times a year were over in Jacksonville at the Air Force Base over there. Here's a Ground Observer's Guide, and we had a couple of editions of that we studied. It was a training manual. Black and white pictures, as I remember, of the plane, and we've still got it. I still have it here, probably in a cedar chest. Not sure where it is, or they are. And aircraft flash, aircraft, and identifying the aircraft type, direction, speed, and any other information available. And that was all based on that training manual. And here's another training observation tool. And I believe that was posted on the wall of the building that we used. And here's a medal that was awarded to those who served as a observer. I think you had to have a minimum number of hours. And my mother and I both have one of those. And then some bars that went below them based on numbers of hours of service. Here you see some pictures of some work that was going on with the observers. Here you can see a merit badge, which both of us, my mother and I, were awarded at the Jacksonville ceremony. And that was for 250 hours, which we both got. And then we had one for 1,000 hours. And then there's a patch. This is a picture I found from Cairo, Georgia, Skywatch Tower. So it was a real deal back in the Cold War days of the 50s.